The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Whitmore Arts Academy as 17-year-old Lily Chun carefully maneuvered her grandmother's old piano bench through the ornate entrance doors. The bench, with its worn velvet seat and scratched wooden legs, looked almost apologetic next to the gleaming chandeliers and pristine, white walls of the prestigious Academy. Lily had been dreaming of this day for months. The annual talent showcase at Whitmore was legendary in their small town. Students from the Academy regularly went on to perform at Carnegie Hall, join world-famous orchestras, and study at the most exclusive music schools in the country. For a girl from the other side of town whose family ran a small bakery, this was her one shot at proving she belonged in their world. She clutched a manila folder containing her sheet music, pages softened from countless hours of practice. Inside were handwritten notes in the margins, little reminders she'd scribbled to herself during late-night practice sessions. Her grandmother had taught her to always mark her music, to make it truly her own. The memory made her smile despite her nerves. The backstage area buzzed with activity as students and their families prepared for the evening's performance. Lily couldn't help but notice the stark differences around her. Other students arrived, with professional piano tuners, gleaming instrument cases that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent, and parents wearing designer clothes who spoke in hushed tones about connections at Juilliard and the Boston Conservatory. Her own mother had dropped her off earlier with a tight hug and whispered words of encouragement. "Just play from your heart, sweetheart. That's all you can do." Her parents couldn't afford to take time off work to stay for the showcase, but Lily understood. The bakery needed them, especially with the new competition from the fancy coffee shop chain that had opened downtown. The donated piano assigned to her sat in the corner of the practice room, a 1970s upright with slightly yellowed keys and a few small scratches on its wooden surface. It wasn't much to look at, but Lily had grown up playing instruments just like this one. She'd learned to find the beauty in imperfection, to work with what she had rather than wish for what she didn't. As she began her pre-performance ritual of checking the piano's tuning, she noticed someone watching her from across the room. Professor Vincent Ashworth, the Academy's legendary music director, stood with his arms crossed, observing her with the kind of look reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of his expensive leather shoes. Professor Ashworth was everything Lily had imagined a prestigious music director would be. Tall and imposing, with perfectly styled silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His reputation preceded him. Former students spoke of his brilliance and his exacting standards in equal measure. Some whispered that he could be cruel, but Lily had always believed that greatness required sacrifice. She tried to focus on her tuning, but she could feel his gaze burning into her back. When she finally looked up, he was walking directly toward her, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. "Excuse me, young lady." His voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the room stop. "What?" "They were doing." "I couldn't help but notice your instrument." Lily stood up straighter, her hands still resting on the piano keys. "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" Professor Ashworth circled the piano slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Well, I suppose that depends on your definition of problem." He gestured grandly at the other pianos in the room, sleek, black concert grands that gleamed under the stage lights. "You see, this is Whitmore Arts Academy. We have certain standards. Here, certain expectations." A small crowd had begun to gather, other students and their parents drawn by the professor's commanding presence. Lily felt her cheeks growing warm, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I understand, sir. I've been practicing very hard for this opportunity." "Oh, I'm sure you have, dear." His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "But practicing hard and understanding the level of musicianship we expect here are two very different things. This instrument, for instance." He tapped the piano's wooden surface with one manicured finger. "When was this last tuned?" "Professionally, I mean. I tune it myself, sir. My grandmother taught me how." A few snickers rippled through the growing crowd. Professor Ashworth raised an eyebrow as if this confirmed his worst suspicions. "Your grandmother, I see." He turned to address the audience that had formed around them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely what I mean when I talk about maintaining the integrity of our program. Some people, well-meaning though they may be, simply don't understand the caliber of artistry we cultivate here at Whitmore. Lily felt like she was shrinking with each word. The other students were staring at her now, some with pity, others with the kind of superiority that came from knowing they belonged in this world while she clearly didn't. Perhaps, Professor Ashworth continued, his voice growing louder, you might be more comfortable at the community center talent show. I believe they have one next month, much more, accommodating to various skill levels. The words hit Lily like physical blows. She'd spent months preparing for this moment, saving every penny to pay the registration fee, staying up late after helping at the bakery to practice until her fingers ached. Her grandmother's piano, the one she'd learned to play on, the one that had carried her family's dreams across an ocean, was being dismissed as inadequate, but something in Professor Ashworth's tone, in the way he looked at her like she was something that had wandered in from the street, sparked something deeper than embarrassment. It was anger, pure and simple. With respect, sir, Lily said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I registered for this showcase just like everyone else. I paid the same fee, and I've prepared just as hard as any other student here. Professor Ashworth's eyes narrowed. Preparation, my dear girl, is about more than just practicing. It's about understanding context, about respecting the institution you're representing. This piano, he gestured dismissively, belongs in someone's living room, not on our stage. But sir, the music doesn't come from the piano, Lily said, her voice growing stronger. It comes from the person playing it. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the tension in the air. Some parents were nodding in agreement with the professor, while others looked uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. How wonderfully naive, Professor Ashworth said with a condescending smile. That's exactly the kind of thinking that separates serious musicians from hobbyists. Lily felt tears threatening to spill over, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Instead, she turned back to her piano and began arranging her sheet music with deliberate care. I suppose we'll see tonight, she said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Professor Ashworth's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. Yes, he said, his voice carrying a promise of things to come. I suppose we will. As the crowd dispersed, Lily remained at her piano, her hands resting on the keys that had been her constant companions for as long as she could remember. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the small imperfections in the wood, the tiny scratches that told the story of decades of music making. She thought about her grandmother, who had played this same style of piano in a small apartment, filling their home with melodies that spoke of hope and dreams. Tonight she would honor that legacy, regardless of what Professor Ashworth or anyone else thought about her instrument. The real performance was still hours away, but the battle lines had already been drawn. The afternoon rehearsal was scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock sharp. Lily had spent the lunch break in a quiet corner of the Academy's garden, trying to calm her nerves and review her music one last time. The confrontation with Professor Ashworth had left her shaken, but she was determined not to let it derail her focus. When she returned to the performance hall, the atmosphere had changed. Word of the morning's incident had spread through the academy like wildfire. She could feel eyes following her as she made her way to the backstage area. Conversations stopping mid-sentence as she passed. Professor Ashworth stood center stage, clipboard in hand, surveying the setup like a general inspecting his troops. The concert grand pianos gleamed under the stage lights, their black surfaces so polished they reflected the ornate ceiling above. Her own piano sat off to one side, looking even more humble in the dramatic lighting. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor, Ashworth's voice boomed across the hall. We'll be conducting our final rehearsal now. This is your opportunity to work out any technical difficulties before tonight's performance. His eyes swept across the assembled students and parents. I trust everyone understands the importance of maintaining our standards. The first few students ran through their pieces flawlessly. A young violinist played Bach with precision that would have impressed professionals twice her age. Twin brothers performed a piano duet that had clearly been polished through years of expensive lessons. Each performance received approving nods from Professor Ashworth and polite applause from the gathered audience. Lily watched from the wings, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She'd been scheduled to rehearse 7th, but as student after student took their turn, she noticed her name hadn't been called. Professor Ashworth, she finally approached him during a brief break. I think there might be some confusion about my rehearsal time. He looked up from his clipboard with feigned surprise. Oh yes, Miss Chun, I've made a small adjustment to the schedule. He turned to address the nearby faculty members and parents, his voice carrying easily across the space. I thought it would be prudent to evaluate each setup individually before we proceed. Mrs. Rodriguez, Lily's music teacher from her public school, had arrived to support her student. She stepped forward with a diplomatic smile. I'm sure Lily's prepared an excellent piece for tonight. She's been working incredibly hard. I'm certain she has, Professor Ashworth replied, his tone suggesting the opposite. However, we must consider the acoustic integrity of the entire performance. Some instruments require more careful consideration than others. He began walking toward Lily's piano, his entourage of faculty members trailing behind him like a procession. The casual conversations in the hall died down as people turned to watch the impromptu inspection. Now then, Professor Ashworth said, circling the piano slowly, let's see what we're working with here. He pressed a few keys, frowning at the sound. Mrs. Patterson, he called to another faculty member, would you mind lending your expert ear to this? Mrs. Patterson, the Academy's piano instructor, approached reluctantly. She was a kind woman who had always been supportive of scholarship students. But Lily could see the uncomfortable position she'd been placed in. The tuning seems adequate, Mrs. Patterson said carefully. Adequate, Professor Ashworth repeated, as if the word left a bad taste in his mouth. But is adequate really what we strive for at Whitmore? He gestured broadly at the other instruments. These pianos were professionally tuned this morning by the same technician who maintains the instruments at Lincoln Center. This one ... He tapped Lily's piano with his pen. Well, it's been tuned by a teenager. Several parents in the growing crowd murmured among themselves. Lily caught fragments of their conversations. Scholarship students, different standards. Maybe she doesn't understand. Furthermore, Professor Ashworth continued, his voice rising with authority, we must consider the visual presentation. Tonight's performance will be photographed for our promotional materials. Alumni donors will be in attendance. The mayor's office has sent a representative. He paused for effect. We cannot afford to present anything that might reflect poorly on the Academy's reputation. One well-dressed mother nodded vigorously. Absolutely. We pay substantial tuition to maintain a certain level of excellence. My thoughts exactly, Mrs. Wellington, Professor Ashworth beamed at her. Excellence is not negotiable. Lily felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself and her instrument, but every time she opened her mouth, Professor Ashworth seemed to anticipate her objection. Now, I don't want anyone to think I'm being unfair, he continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Lily's skin crawl. I believe in giving everyone a chance to succeed within their capabilities. That's why I've decided to make a small adjustment to tonight's program. He pulled out his clipboard and made a show of consulting his notes. Miss Chun will perform last in tonight's showcase. This way, if there are any technical difficulties with her instrument, it won't disrupt the flow of the other performances. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Lily was being relegated to the end of the program, positioned as an afterthought rather than a legitimate performer. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward again, her diplomatic facade beginning to crack. Professor Ashworth, I don't think that's necessary. Lily has practiced extensively and Mrs. Rodriguez, he interrupted smoothly. I appreciate your loyalty to your student. It speaks well of your character. However, I think we need to be realistic about expectations here. He turned to address the wider audience. Not every student who walks through our doors is destined for Carnegie Hall. Some are simply enthusiastic amateurs. The words hit Lily like a physical blow. Around her, she could hear whispered conversations growing louder. Some parents were nodding in agreement while others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," said a voice from the back of the room. An elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a warm smile had been watching the entire exchange. "I'm Dr. Martinez from the State Arts Council. We provide funding for programs that encourage musical education across all socioeconomic backgrounds." Professor Ashworth's confident expression faltered slightly. "Of course, Dr. Martinez. We're always grateful for the council's support. I'm particularly interested in seeing how academies like Whitmore nurture talent regardless of the student's background or equipment," Dr. Martinez continued. "After all, some of our greatest musicians came from very humble beginnings." The professor's smile looked strained now. "Naturally, we pride ourselves on inclusivity. But the damage had been done. Lily could see it in the faces around her, the pity, the condescension, the assumption that she was out of her league. Some of the other students were whispering behind their hands, casting glances in her direction. "Very well then," Professor Ashworth announced, regaining his composure. "We'll proceed with the adjusted schedule. Miss Chun, please ensure your instrument is properly prepared for tonight. We wouldn't want any surprises." As the rehearsal continued, Lily sat quietly by her piano, watching the other students run through their pieces with confidence born of years of expensive training and unwavering support. Each performance was met with enthusiastic praise from Professor Ashworth, who seemed to have an endless supply of superlatives for students whose families could afford the academy's steep tuition. When her turn finally came, the energy in the room had shifted. Conversations continued in the audience, phones buzzed with messages, and Professor Ashworth checked his watch impatiently. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Chun," he said, his tone suggesting she was already taking too long. Lily placed her hands on the keys and began to play a gentle melody, but she could barely hear herself think over the noise in the room. It was clear that her rehearsal was being treated as an intermission rather than a legitimate preparation for a performance. That's sufficient," Professor Ashworth interrupted before she could finish. "We need to move along with the schedule." As she gathered her music, Lily overheard two mothers talking near the stage. "I feel sorry for the girl," one said, "but really, what did she expect? This isn't the place for charity cases." The words followed her as she left the stage, each syllable a reminder that in their eyes, she would never belong in their world of privilege and perfection. The evening had finally arrived. Backstage at Whitmore Arts Academy, the air buzzed with nervous energy and expensive perfume. Students in their finest concert attire paced back and forth, running through scales and breathing exercises. Parents clutched programs and adjusted their children's bow ties and pearl necklaces. One last time, Lily sat alone in a corner, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the designer gowns and tailored suits around her. She'd borrowed the dress from her older cousin, and while it was clean and pressed, it couldn't hide the fact that it had seen better days. Her grandmother's small silver locket hung around her neck, the only jewelry she owned, but also the most precious thing she possessed. The main auditorium was filling up with Whitmore's elite audience. Through the heavy curtains, she could hear the murmur of conversation, the rustle of programs, and the occasional burst of laughter. The mayor was there, along with several city council members. Alumni who had gone on to prestigious careers in music sat in the front rows. Local business owners who donated generously to the academy had reserved seats. As showtime approached, Professor Ashworth made his rounds backstage, offering final words of encouragement to his students. Lily watched him move from performer to performer, his face beaming with pride as he spoke to each one. "Remember, David, let the music breathe during that second movement," he told a young cellist. "Excellent work in rehearsal today. Rebecca, your interpretation of that Chopin piece is absolutely stunning." He praised a pianist whose family had endowed a scholarship fund at the academy. When he reached Lily, his expression shifted subtly. "Miss Chun," he said with forced politeness, "I trust you're feeling prepared for tonight." "Yes, sir," Lily replied, though her hands were trembling slightly. "Good, good." He glanced at his expensive watch. "Now, I've taken the liberty of adjusting your introduction for tonight's program. Something more appropriate to the circumstances." Before Lily could ask what he meant, he was already moving on to the next student. She tried to push down the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. Whatever he had planned, she would face it with dignity. The show began with a flourish. The Academy's chamber orchestra opened with a piece by Mozart, their performance polished to perfection. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and Professor Ashworth beamed from his position at the side of the stage. One by one, the students took their turns. A young soprano sang an aria that brought tears to many eyes. Twin brothers played a violin duet that showcased years of expensive training. Each performance seemed to top the last, and Professor Ashworth's introductions grew more elaborate with each act. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced as the evening progressed, "tonight you are witnessing the future of classical music. These young artists represent the very best of what dedicated training and natural talent can achieve." Lily watched from the wings as student after student received standing ovations. The audience was clearly enjoying themselves, and she could see why. These were extraordinary young musicians, each one polished and confident in their abilities. But as the evening wore on, she began to notice something troubling. Several audience members were checking their phones, glancing at their watches, and whispering to their companions. Some were even beginning to gather their coats and purses, preparing to leave early. "How many more?" she heard one woman ask her. "Husband, just one more, I think," he replied, consulting his program. "Some scholarship student." The words stung, but Lily tried to focus on her breathing exercises. She had worked too hard to let their dismissive attitudes affect her performance. Finally, her moment arrived. The previous performer, a talented flutist, had just finished to thunderous applause. Professor Ashworth stepped up to the microphone, his smile notably less enthusiastic than it had been all evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable change in tone, "our final performer tonight represents one of Whitmore's community outreach initiatives. Miss Lily Chun is a scholarship recipient from our local public school system." The introduction was brief, almost perfunctory. There were no glowing comments about her talent or preparation, no mention of her musical background or the piece she would be performing. It was as if she were an afterthought, a box to be checked off rather than a serious artist. "Miss Chun will be performing on her own instrument tonight," Professor Ashworth continued, and Lily caught the slight emphasis on the word own. "We hope you'll appreciate this opportunity to see how music can bring our community together across all backgrounds." The patronizing tone was unmistakable. He was essentially telling the audience not to expect too much, that this was more about charity than artistry. As he stepped away from the microphone, Lily caught him checking his watch. Again, a gesture that several audience members noticed and mimicked. She walked onto the stage to polite but lukewarm applause. The audience was clearly ready for the evening to end. Some people were already standing, putting on their coats. Others were scrolling through their phones. Paying her little attention. As she approached her piano, she could hear fragments of conversation from the front rows. "Poor thing," one woman whispered loudly enough for Lily to hear. "This is probably the biggest audience she ever played for." "It's nice that they give these kids a chance," another replied, "but I do wish they'd put them earlier in the program." Lily reached her piano bench and paused for a moment. The instrument looked even more humble under the bright stage lights, its imperfections magnified by the unforgiving illumination. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, most of them filled with pity or impatience rather than anticipation. Professor Ashworth stood prominently at the side of the stage, his arms crossed, wearing an expression that suggested he was enduring this performance rather than enjoying it. His body language spoke volumes to the audience, many of whom were taking their cues from his obvious lack of enthusiasm. Just as Lily was about to sit down, Professor Ashworth leaned toward a group of parents in the front row and made a comment that carried clearly across the stage. "Well," he said with a resigned sigh, "let's see what our little pianist can do with her unique instrument." The comment drew uncomfortable chuckles from some audience members, while others looked embarrassed by his unprofessional behavior, but the damage was done. The final performer of the evening had been reduced to a curiosity, a novelty act to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Lily felt something shift inside her chest. All evening she had watched these privileged students perform with confidence, knowing that their every note would be celebrated and their every mistake forgiven. They had the best instruments, the most expensive training, and an audience that believed in them before they played a single note, but she had something they didn't have. She had the fire that comes from being underestimated, the determination that grows from being dismissed, and the deep, unshakable knowledge that music, real music, doesn't come from perfect instruments or perfect circumstances. It comes from the heart, from the soul, from the places where pain and joy meet and create something beautiful. She thought about her grandmother, who had played piano in a small apartment with thin walls, neighbors who complained about the noise, and dreams that seemed impossible. She thought about her parents, working double shifts at the bakery to pay for her lessons, never complaining about the sacrifices they made. As she sat down at the bench and placed her hands on the keys, Lily felt a calm settle over her. The nervous teenager who had walked onto the stage was gone, replaced by someone who understood that this moment was about more than just music. It was about proving that worth isn't measured by the price of your instrument or the size of your bank account. The audience fell silent, but it was the silence of obligation rather than anticipation. They were waiting for her to confirm their low expectations, to justify their dismissive attitudes, to play her little piece so they could all go home feeling good about the Academy's charitable efforts. Instead, Lily was about to give them something they would never forget. The auditorium held its breath for just a moment, the kind of silence that comes before something either wonderful or terrible happens. Lily's fingers rested on the keys of her grandmother's piano, feeling the familiar smoothness of ivory that had been worn by decades of music making. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost whispered, like a secret being shared between old friends. It wasn't a piece anyone in the audience recognized from their expensive concert programs or prestigious music schools. This was something entirely different, something that came from a place deeper than technique or training. The melody told a story. It spoke of a young woman who had left everything behind in a small village, carrying nothing but hopes and dreams across an ocean to a new world. The music painted pictures of crowded ships, of tearful goodbyes, of the courage it takes to start over in a place where nobody knows your name. As Lily's fingers danced across the keys, the restless energy in the audience began to settle. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phone screens went dark. Even the people who had been putting on their coats paused, their arms still halfway through sleeves, caught by something they couldn't quite name. The piano itself seemed to come alive under her touch. The slight imperfections in its tone, the subtle variations in how each key responded became part of the story. This wasn't the pristine sound of a concert grand. It was something warmer, more human, more real. Each note carried the weight of history, of family memories, of late-night practice sessions when the rest of the world was asleep. Professor Ashworth, who had been standing with his arms crossed and checking his watch, found himself leaning forward. Slightly, the smug expression on his face was beginning to crack, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. The music grew stronger, more confident. Lily's composition shifted from the gentle story of her grandmother's journey to something more complex, more demanding. Her left hand began an intricate pattern in the bass notes, while her right hand soared above it, creating a conversation between past and present, between dreams and reality. In the third row, Mrs. Wellington, the woman who had earlier nodded so vigorously about maintaining standards, stopped fidgeting with her pearl necklace. Her mouth had fallen slightly open, and she was staring at the stage with an expression of growing amazement. Dr. Martinez from the State Arts Council was taking notes, but his pen had slowed, then stopped entirely. He was listening with the kind of attention that comes from recognizing something truly special. The piece continued to evolve, and Lily seamlessly transitioned into her interpretation of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, but this wasn't just any interpretation. She had arranged the orchestral parts for solo piano, creating a version that was both technically brilliant and emotionally devastating. Her fingers flew across the keys with a precision that would have impressed the most demanding conservatory professors. But more than that, she played with a passion that seemed to set the air itself on fire. Every note was deliberate, every phrase shaped with the kind of musical intelligence that can't be taught in any classroom. The famous opening melody, usually shared between piano and orchestra, now belonged entirely to her. She made the piano sing like a human voice, weep like a broken heart, and soar like a bird finding its wings for the first time. The slightly imperfect tone of her instrument became an asset rather than a liability, giving the music a raw, emotional quality that the pristine concert grands could never match. In the wings, the other student performers had stopped their post-show celebrations to listen. The talented violinist who had played earlier was shaking her head in disbelief. The soprano, who had brought tears to eyes with her aria, was wiping away tears of her own, but for entirely different reasons. "My God," whispered Mrs. Patterson. "The Academy's piano instructor to a colleague? Where did she learn to play like that?" But this wasn't just about technical skill. Lily was pouring her entire life into this performance. Every slight, every struggle, every moment of doubt and determination. The music became a conversation with everyone who had ever told her she wasn't good enough, everyone who had looked at her instrument and seen only limitations, everyone who had assumed that excellence required wealth and connections. The Rachmaninoff built to its famous climax, and Lily's arrangement transformed the piano into an entire orchestra. Her left hand thundered in the bass while her right hand sang the melody with such clarity and power that people in the back row could feel it in their chests. The piano bench creaked slightly under the force of her performance, but the sound only added to the authenticity of the moment. Professor Ashworth was no longer checking his watch. His confident smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by an expression that looked almost like fear. He was watching the audience as much as the performance, and what he saw there was beginning to worry him, because the audience was transforming too. The polite, restrained applause that had greeted the other performers was forgotten. People were leaning forward in their seats, completely absorbed in what they were hearing. Some were crying openly. Others were gripping their armrests, caught up in the emotional journey that Lily was taking them on. The mayor, who had been scrolling through emails on his phone, had put the device away entirely. His wife was clutching his arm, her knuckles white with tension and excitement. Even the catering staff, who had been quietly cleaning up in the back of the auditorium, had stopped their work to listen. They stood frozen with dirty dishes in their hands, their own eyes wide with wonder. As the piece reached its final movement, Lily seemed to grow larger on the stage. Her small frame, which had looked so fragile and out of place just minutes before, now commanded the entire auditorium. Every person in that room was hanging on her every note, following her on a musical journey that was taking them places they had never been before. The music spoke of triumph over adversity, of beauty found in unexpected places, of the power of the human spirit to rise above circumstances. It was everything that Professor Ashworth and his elite world had tried to dismiss, transformed into something so beautiful and powerful that it couldn't be ignored. Lily's grandmother's piano, with its slightly yellowed keys and small imperfections, was singing like it had never sung before. The instrument that had been dismissed as inadequate was now producing music that was making grown adults weep and hardened. Critics reconsider everything they thought they knew about what makes a performance truly great. The final notes began to build, and Lily threw everything she had into them. Her entire body was involved in the performance now, swaying with the music, her face transformed by the joy and pain and absolute commitment of the moment. She was no longer playing the piano, she was speaking through it, telling her story. And her family's story, and the story of everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. The last chord rang out across the auditorium, sustained by the piano's natural resonance and by the absolute silence of an audience that had just witnessed something extraordinary. The note seemed to hang in the air forever, as if the music itself was reluctant to let the moment end. Then there was silence. Complete, total silence that stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. In that silence, something fundamental had changed. The girl who had walked onto the stage as an afterthought had just proved that talent and heart could overcome any disadvantage, any prejudice, any limitation that small minds might try to impose. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibility and change, until finally, inevitably, it shattered into something that would change everything. The silence that followed Lily's performance seemed to last forever. In that moment, the entire auditorium felt suspended in time, as if everyone was afraid that moving or breathing might somehow break the spell of what they had just witnessed. Then, like a dam bursting, the applause began. It started with Dr. Martinez from the State Arts Council, who shot to his feet so quickly that his program fell to the floor. His clapping was thunderous, echoing through the stunned silence like gunshots. Within seconds, the woman beside him joined in, then the person behind her, and then it spread like wildfire through the entire auditorium. But this wasn't the polite, measured applause that had greeted the other performers throughout the evening. This was something raw and spontaneous, the kind of reaction that happens when people witness something that touches them to their core. Adults were wiping tears from their eyes as they clapped. Some people were shouting, "Bravo!" at the top of their lungs. Lily sat at her piano bench, stunned by the response. She had poured everything she had into that performance, but she hadn't expected this. The same audience that had been checking their phones and putting on their coats just 20 minutes earlier was now giving her a standing ovation that showed no signs of stopping. Mrs. Wellington, the woman who had earlier complained about maintaining standards, was clapping so hard her jewelry was rattling. Tears were streaming down her face, and she kept shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "Incredible," she kept saying to her husband. "Absolutely incredible." The mayor had pulled out his phone again, but this time it was to record the standing ovation. His wife was practically bouncing in her seat, applauding with the enthusiasm of someone at a rock concert rather than a classical music recital. In the wings, the other student performers had emerged from backstage to witness the reaction. They were applauding too, their faces showing a mixture of amazement and respect. The competitive atmosphere that had existed earlier in the evening had evaporated, replaced by genuine admiration for what they had just experienced. Professor Ashworth stood frozen at the side of the stage, his face a mask of shock and growing panic. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to end. His carefully orchestrated program, designed to showcase the Academy's elite students and maintain the social order he had worked so hard to create, had just been turned upside down by a girl with a borrowed dress and an old piano. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. People in the back rows were whistling and cheering. Some audience members were calling for an encore, though Lily was so overwhelmed she could barely process what was happening around her. Finally, as the applause began to die down, Mrs. Rodriguez made her way onto the stage. The music teacher's eyes were bright with tears and pride as she approached the microphone that Professor Ashworth had abandoned. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I think we've all just witnessed something truly special tonight." The audience erupted in agreement with more cheers and applause. "I've had the privilege of teaching Lily for the past 3 years," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "and I want you to know that what you just heard represents countless hours of dedication and practice. Lily works at her family's bakery every day. After school, then practices piano until late at night. She's been saving money for 2 years just to afford tonight's registration fee." The audience listened in rapt attention, and Lily could see the expressions on their faces changing as they learned more about her story. The condescending pity that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by genuine respect and admiration. The piece you just heard, Mrs. Rodriguez went on, the beautiful opening composition, was written by Lily herself. It tells the story of her grandmother's journey from a small village in China to America, carrying nothing but dreams and determination. And the piano she played on tonight? It belonged to her grandmother, who taught Lily her first scales on those very keys. The audience was hanging on every word now. Some people were nodding, finally understanding the significance of what they had witnessed. This hadn't just been a performance, it had been a story, a piece of family history brought to life through music, Professor Ashworth, Mrs. Rodriguez said, turning to address the music director directly. I believe you had some comments about Lily's instrument earlier today? All eyes turned to Professor Ashworth, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His face had gone pale, and he was nervously adjusting his tie. The confident, condescending man who had dismissed Lily earlier was nowhere to be seen. W.E.L. He stammered, clearly struggling to find words that wouldn't make him look worse than he already did, but the audience was no longer interested in his excuses. People were beginning to voice their own opinions, and they weren't holding back. That was the most moving performance I've heard in years, called out a woman from the fourth row. Shame on anyone who tried to discourage that young lady, added another voice. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, his expression serious. As a representative of the State Arts Council, I have to say that what we witnessed tonight represents exactly the kind of talent and dedication our programs are designed to support. This young woman has shown us that excellence comes from passion and hard work, not from expensive equipment or family connections. His words carried weight with the audience, many of whom were nodding in agreement. The social dynamics in the room had completely shifted. Lily, who had been treated as a charity case just hours earlier, was now the star of the evening. Professor Ashworth made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Of course, we're all very proud of Miss Chen's progress, he said, stepping toward the microphone. The Academy has always believed in nurturing talent wherever we find it. But his words rang hollow after everything that had happened. Several people in the audience actually groaned at his obvious attempt to take credit for Lily's success. With respect, Professor, Dr. Martinez interrupted, I don't think the Academy can take credit for what we heard tonight. This young woman's talent is entirely her own. The criticism was polite but pointed, and it was clear that Professor Ashworth's behavior had not gone unnoticed by the influential people in the audience. Over the following weeks, the impact of that night continued to ripple outward. Someone had recorded Lily's performance on their phone, and the video quickly spread across social media. The caption read, "This is what real talent looks like. It doesn't need a perfect instrument, just a perfect heart." The video went viral, accumulating millions of views and thousands of comments from people around the world who were moved by Lily's story and her incredible performance. Music schools that had never heard of her began reaching out with scholarship offers. Professional musicians shared the video with their own followers, praising both her technical skill and her emotional depth, but perhaps the most satisfying change was what happened at Whitmore Arts Academy itself. The board of directors, embarrassed by the negative attention surrounding Professor Ashworth's behavior, launched a formal review of the Academy's policies and culture. They announced new initiatives to support students from diverse backgrounds and to ensure that all performers were treated with equal respect and encouragement. Professor Ashworth, meanwhile, found himself facing uncomfortable questions about his teaching methods and his attitude toward students who didn't fit his narrow definition of excellence. Within a few months, he quietly announced his retirement, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. For Lily, the night that had started as her biggest challenge became the beginning of an incredible journey. She eventually chose to attend a prestigious conservatory on a full scholarship, but she never forgot the lessons she learned that evening at Whitmore. Success, she realized, wasn't about having the best equipment or the most expensive training. It was about having the courage to share your authentic self with the world, regardless of what others might think. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world is ready to listen.